Through the concrete cracks worn weary by work boots and high heels. Through the concrete cracks showered in tears of sorrow, tears of joy. Through the concrete cracks rumbled by reverberations of 100 years, a flower on the hill takes its first breath, and a grand hope springs. Welcome to the Spring Street podcast at the intersection of creation and destruction in the heart of downtown Los Angeles. And now, a word from the sponsors. This podcast is sponsored by Starship Kairos, a podcast studio available for bookings in downtown Los Angeles. Starship Kairos is where my guests and I make this show happen. Soundproofed, cozy, and equipped with professional audio gear, Starship Kairos is an ideal location for any type of podcast. Starship Kairos offers a full suite of services including content consultation, mixing and mastering, and custom jingle writing. For rates and booking, check them out on Instagram at Starship Kairos or click on the link in the description. And now, let's dive in. All right, Callan.
Is this it? Are we starting?
This is it.
Or is this the test?
So, okay, if you're going to be interviewing me, I think you have to say the intro.
All right.
Well, you don't know what the intro is. You got to say, welcome to the Spring Street podcast.
Spring Street.
That is the name of the podcast.
It seems very geographically limited for someone who lives a van life.
This is true, but the studio is located on Spring Street.
Okay.
In downtown Los Angeles.
And Spring Street sounds much nicer than Kruger, which is the street we're on now, which sounds like a character in a horror movie.
It is a character in a horror movie, so. Well,
okay.
This is the Spring Street podcast, so.
And we'll just cut out everything before?
There's no cutting. This is all, this is raw.
Hey,
this is real.
Then welcome to the Spring Street podcast.
That was beautiful.
We're here interviewing the normal interviewer to find out what's going on in his life.
It's very unconventional.
Yeah, it's very weird.
I'll go on the record and say this was not my idea. So, but I was curious when I heard that you wanted to do this, and I was willing and open for something unknown. So
you have not been prompted or prepared or in any way.
I have no idea.
This.
I have no idea what you're going to ask me.
Let me ask you this. Is there any chance that I could ask you something that you would slam down the microphone and storm out of the studio here?
Probably. It would probably be impossible to elicit that reaction.
Yeah, I would think so. All right. Then anything goes. Right?
Well, we'll cross that bridge if we get there. We'll see. But, okay. Callan, what do you want to ask me?
Okay. So the reason I want to do an interview with you is because you are the only person I know that has lived your unique experience. I mean, it's a very unique.
This is true.
Upbringing and how you've been running with life and doing what you want to do and making the most of it, handling ups and downs. And so I wanted to get your perspective. And as you know, I'm involved heavily in the Christian movement. And so I wanted to hear your perspective about your life and introduction to that and feelings on it now and how it's played out in your life. And we have a cliche when we talk about people who used to be very involved in the Christian community and have since distanced themselves, and people will use terms like walking away from the faith or something like that. And it sounds like it's not genuinely the response of the people who are actually doing it. It sounds like a kind of a cheesy cliche that's put on people. And so I wanted to hear, like, how would you describe that transition that was I would imagine, a large part of your life?
So just to clarify, transition being me walking away from faith?
That, well, I like I said, that sounds kind of cliche. Let's say someone who would have been, I would imagine, I don't mean to put something on you, would have been comfortable with saying that you were a Christian and now not comfortable saying you are a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
So that transition to go from, I mean, I would imagine, as many of us do, you figure things out as you grow up. You don't hang on to everything that you had as a child, but you had a pretty strong introduction to Christian beliefs and upbringing, and you have since, I imagine, I want to hear it from you, come to the conclusion that maybe there's a reason to not believe in that, whether it's the history of it or the claims of Christianity or something like that. But you are an articulate person who's willing to share, and I have not been able to hear that from someone. So I just want to hear kind of about your journey, where you would say you were and what changed in that and how that's impacted your life and so on.
Okay. Well, to speak to a couple things for clarity that you just said, I would agree with you. Yes. At one point in time, I would have absolutely identified as a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And currently I do not identify as a Christian. To add some context about my background for people who don't know about my background, I grew up in a Christian family. My father is a pastor currently and has been a pastor my entire life. My mom taught at a Christian private school that I attended for 12 years, from grade 1 to grade 12. And I went to a Christian university for 2 years following high school. And my time throughout that, I was heavily involved in the church, going to youth group in middle school and high school, and participating in worship team, playing on the worship team, leading worship, having a Bible study, going on to college and having a Bible study as a job, being a Bible study leader, playing on a worship team, being involved in a local church, playing on a worship team in a local church. So I would say that I was heavily involved in the church for my life up until I was about 21, I would say. And so to speak to the transition, I think that there are a few different things that are at play in that conversation, because it's not black and white, and it's complex, but I don't think that complexity is a way of trying to obfuscate any kind of motivations. I think that that's just the nature of life. Like the decisions that we make are complex. It's not always straightforward. So there's a lot of different things to unpack, because I think that perhaps in the moment, certain things were maybe more emotionally informed by situations between, people. And that's also different than the reflections that come in the days after, in the weeks after, in the years after. And so
are you describing your initial connection to Christianity as being one that was maybe based on relationships, or are you describing your transition away from Christianity as being affected by relationships?
Well, that's actually an interesting way of describing it, because I would say that my Christianity growing up was 100% wrapped in relationships. I wouldn't have been a Christian if I didn't grow up in a Christian community, if I didn't have a Christian family, if I didn't have that influence. There's no reason to think that I would have. Perhaps I might have stumbled across a Christian community in middle school or high school, as many middle schoolers and high schoolers do. But that's, I guess, a counterfactual that's a little hard to, prove, or, it's like,
right.
Based on my experience, I would say my Christianity, I came to it relationally as opposed to coming through it by study. I wasn't, a 6-year-old or a 12-year-old or a 15-year-old reading deeply about religion, philosophy, and trying to make a decision, I guess you could say, rationally. I would say that the reason why I was a Christian was because the people around me were Christians, and that was what was taught to me. And that actually, I think, ties in largely to one of the reasons why I wouldn't call myself a Christian. And there's something that I want to be really clear about, and that is, currently I wouldn't say that I have formally rejected Christianity, but I don't hold an active belief that Jesus of Nazareth is the Son of God, died for my sins, and he is the only way to salvation, and that the only other alternative is damnation or hell or separation from God. Like, I don't hold a belief that that is truth. So by definition, I am not a Christian because I don't hold that belief. That's not to say that I'm going around saying that's not true. That's false. It's just to say that I don't actively have that belief system. And I think that if we want to talk about timeline of how I got to that place, there are kind of a few key moments that brought me
I'd like to hear about those.
Brought me there. So I would say, firstly, my experience moving out of my community, I think, was really eye-opening, because when I turned 18, I moved back to Canada. And even though I moved to a Christian community, because I was going to a Christian university in Canada, I was still being exposed to new people, new ideas, and ultimately, it was the threshold of a big step into the unknown, which was into the big bad secular world, apart from my family, my community, my institutions of faith.
Was that something that you were excited to do? Or were you a little bit
what's actually
afraid?
kind of ironic is when I was at Trinity, the Christian university, I had this conviction that, I had thoughts about becoming a missionary or a pastor, and I was disturbed by the insular nature of the culture in which I was in. I felt like it was just a bunch of Christians who were just huddled together, constantly debating about predestination versus universalism, and it just kind of felt like, a little bit of a circle jerk of what are we doing if based on this book that I'm reading, we're talking about heaven and hell, we're talking about life eternal or damnation. Like, maybe it's more important that we're out in the world evangelizing. And so part of the reason why I left, there were two reasons why I left. One, there were maybe three. One was that I actually wanted to be in the world so that I could tell people about Jesus. The other was I wanted to learn how to do something with my hands. I wanted to learn a trade, and I was tired of paying a lot of money for tuition. And so the reason why I left was actually more, I guess you could say, evangelical than not. And part of my, I guess, interest in going to a different university, part of it was to be amongst people who didn't believe the same thing that I believed, because I felt like that was our calling as Christians, to go out and preach. So, and I think too, now that I'm talking about this, something that comes to mind is I actually started really intensely reading the Bible when I was at Trinity, reading through the New Testament. I was leading a group of guys in my dorm through the New Testament. We were reading through the whole New Testament. And I was also reading a lot of Shane Claiborne at the time, who, even though I'm not a Christian, I still actually really admire and respect Shane Claiborne. I think that there's a lot of interesting things that he has to say. But I began to become really critical of the society that I came from, the Christian culture that I came from, because I felt like there was a lot of blatant hypocrisy and a big disconnect between what I was reading in the New Testament and what I actually saw. And what I mean by that, and that's also part of it, was like, it's almost like a little bit of a cliche or stereotype that, kid goes off to college, kid becomes a communist or an anarchist or a hippie liberal and like hates the society that he came from. Nothing new, nothing unique there. But that was exactly what was happening to me. I was thinking to myself, okay, wait a minute. If this life and the material possessions that we have are not as important as eternity, in fact, they don't really matter at all because it's all temporal, and the only thing that matters is our relationship with God and spreading the good news about Jesus Christ, then why should I be conforming to any of these things that quote unquote society wants me to focus on? Getting a house, having a good job, having nice things, or even adhering to society, like normative societal practices. But I guess what really troubled me was the fact that I felt like I saw that and was encouraged by that by my Christian community, and that it seemed like there was a lot of superficiality, a lot of focus on material things, and churches to me just began to look like clubhouses, like just fancy organizations with nice buildings and nice TVs and cute little coffee hours. And meanwhile, the nature of the disparity of the world was just absolutely abhorrent in contrast to those things. I just couldn't help but think of the scene of Jesus supposedly flipping the tables in the temple and saying, "What have you done to, God's house? This should be a place of worship." To me, I felt like, looking back at my experience, what I saw was people who maybe had just found something that worked for them, that was comfortable, but that was about it. Like, no one actually was willing to give up everything that they have and follow Jesus. And it just made me wonder, is anyone actually really a Christian? Does anybody actually really embrace this calling? Because it seems like this calling means to truly transcend the materialness of this world. Mm-hmm. And we live in a society that is deeply materialistic. So I think that my questioning began then. It began with those things, and just beginning to feel disturbed and disillusioned by the church. And when I say the church, what I mean is like your typical organization, Sunday church that you find in America and Canada, like based on my experience. So anyways, when I left Trinity, I went on a trip to Europe, and it was my first time really being out in the world on my own. And that was the beginning of discovering new ideas and new ways of life, and meeting people who didn't think the same as me and who had different perspectives and beliefs. I spent some time with some anarchist squatters in Dublin, and I was 20, just bopping around in Europe, and for the first time in my life, I actually felt like I was at home with those people. I felt something that I just had never felt before. And ironically, I was still a Christian at this point. I performed a song. We were like at this warehouse, and it was like the secret warehouse show where you had to get let in with like a special knock, and people were doing fire poi and spoken word and poetry and music, and there was a seance and all sorts of crazy stuff. And they let me play a song, and I played some song that had some like serious spiritual overtones. I can't remember what it was, but a guy came up to me afterwards, and he told me that he was a Christian, that he had been an atheist, but that he was a Christian. He said, I'm not Christian enough for my Christian friends, and I'm not atheist enough for my atheist friends. Or no, it was something like my Christian friends don't accept, like neither group accepts me, which I thought was kind of ironic. But anyways, moving forward, after that, I went to the University of British Columbia, and the beautiful thing about that university is it's so diverse. And I was studying political science, and in my discussion group, we'd have every single continent besides Antarctica represented at the table. It was incredible. There's even one class that I had where we were all going around and talking about why we were studying political science, and this guy is like, I'm from El Salvador, and the reason why I'm here studying political science is because my grandfather was the president of El Salvador. So anyways, I had a lot of exposure to people who did not believe the same thing as me, people who were Muslim, people who were, I guess, maybe atheist. I honestly feel like atheism, it seems few and far between to find atheists in my generation nowadays. I think in high school I met more people who said they were atheists than I do now, approaching 30. But people who were not religious, or maybe they were more spiritual, people who had a Hindu background. And I think that for the first time in my life, I was just finally surrounded by people who didn't think the same as me. And also Christians too. It was a mix. It was a big mix of people. And I was still involved in a church, but still asking all those questions. And then I started a relationship with somebody who wasn't a Christian. And this is kind of where the personal drama actually begins. And that was a very, very, very insightful experience, because for the first time in my life, I was getting a really intimate view of somebody's family and upbringing who didn't have the same kind of upbringing as me. And it was somebody who was from Mexico, and so I was also learning about different customs and different traditions and different ways of life. And there were a lot of things that I saw that I thought were really cool and really beautiful in terms of the values that they had when it came to family. And I don't want to get too in the details about this person for the sake of their privacy. But all that to say, I began to see that there were other ways of life that were also totally fine and valid, that led to good life outcomes. And I guess I also began to learn that life isn't perfect. Things are messy and sloppy no matter what. It doesn't matter if you're a Christian or if you're a Muslim or if you're a Jew. Everyone's got, all sorts of crazy drama in their family. No one's perfect. But through that experience, ultimately, it led to a lot of tension interpersonally in my own community because I was a Christian and I was dating somebody who was not a Christian, and that just wasn't acceptable. And ultimately, and I really don't want to get into the specifics of this because I'm not trying to throw anybody under the bus or put anybody on blast, but because of certain things that happened, I would say that the most pain that I've suffered in this life and the most hurt that I've experienced is from the people that I love the most in the name of Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I would be lying if I said that that wasn't a factor in why I walked away from my faith, because it absolutely was. You know, when I think about those things, even still to this day, even though there's a different thought process and rationality about the reason why I wouldn't call myself a Christian right now, it still is really sad for me to think about what I experienced. And, you know, by far the lowest point that I ever had in my life was sustained during that period because of everything that was happening. And all that to say, it really made me think, is this, like, why am I a part of this community? It made me, I guess, finally question that. Like, what, like, do I really want to be part of this? You know? And I just began to think to myself, okay, well, why am I in this to begin with? And the reason is because I simply grew up in it. You know, if I had grown up in a family that was Muslim, if I'd grown up in a Mormon family, if I'd grown up in a Hindu family, a Jewish family, like, that is what I would be. There's no question about it. And I think that there's an extra effect of being a pastor's kid. I think that there is a certain level of expectation that it can add.
Sure.
And so some people might not agree with this, but I don't think I had any other option, consciously or subconsciously, than to be a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And when I say consciously, you know, really, it was like, we go to church, we're going to church. This is the truth. What I'm teaching you is the truth. Like, this is what it is. Subconsciously, I would say, you know, as humans, we all grow up to develop some kind of a system of emotional response. Like, you learn what works and what doesn't, what makes people happy and what doesn't make people happy. Mm-hmm. And when that's intertwined with a faith system, and you learn, okay, cool, when I do these things, it puts a smile on my parents' face, or when I recite these Bible verses, or when I act this way, I think it begins to build a unconscious framework that you're going to be operating off of. And so as I began to reflect and examine the reasons why I identified as a Christian, what I realized was none of those were a good basis for being a Christian. Mm-hmm. And I adamantly believe that nobody should be a part of a faith just because of tradition. I think that there's a lot of bad things that can come from that. I think that people who hold on to religious, well, there's a gradient there that I would like to get into, but I think on the whole, it is not a good thing maybe specifically because of the world that we live in, which is we don't live in some kind of a tribal community or medieval society in the 1500s where you won't go more than 100 miles from the place you were born your entire life, and you're just stuck with the life you have. Like, we live in a globalized world where we are always going to be confronted with new ideas and new ways of life, and there's this new element, this new tension where, and it is a bit of a Western phenomenon, but that's also changing too. It's becoming just more of a worldwide phenomenon in general, that people really have the ability to choose the life that they want to live.
Mm-hmm.
And that creates a lot of problems, because as humans, we're not used to that. We're used to what's predictable and what can be passed down, because that's how we survive. Now, between two generations, you can have a son or a daughter have a completely different view of how they're going to live their life, and their parents they have no tools in the tool belt to be able to guide them. And that has to do with advances in travel and advances in communication and the proliferation of information through social media. So life is different, and it creates some problems because there's basically just a massive conflict between traditionalism and like an ultra fast-paced progressivism that is just baked into the cake of a post-industrial society. So anyways, back to my ultimate like departure from the faith. I basically
if we could pause at that spot.
Yeah, sure.
I want you to continue on, but I have some questions. There's a couple of things that kind of stood out to me, and I wanted to clarify. So I've heard a lot of people speculate as to their parents' motives for raising them in a Christian tradition. Mm-hmm. They're just trying to exercise power over you, or they're using these made-up rules to keep you out of trouble, or stifle your freedom or creativity, or exhibit some kind of control. In your case, do you see your parents' desire to raise their children in a Christian household? What would you say were their motives for doing that?
Well, I think that's probably relatively easy to answer. I think that based on the Christian faith, if you believe that it's a matter of life and death, mm-hmm. salvation versus damnation, then it's imperative to share that with everybody, especially your children. Now, one thing that I think there's a few different things I want to say on this. First off, I think that religion in general serves as a orienting framework for life. Regardless of what the religion is, it creates some kind of a parameter or a paradigm through which to understand life. And I think that can be helpful regardless of the religion, not even talking about whether or not it's true or false, just practicality. There's substantially different major faith systems, mm-hmm. all with different outcomes, whether we're talking about Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. But, more or less, we have functional societies across the world that are built upon completely different faith structures. But mm-hmm. I think that there's a reason why people are religious. There's a reason why since the dawn of time, we've had some kind of an overarching story about mm-hmm. the nature of reality and why we're here. That's not for nothing. So I think that there's a place for that. And
I'm sorry, say that again.
I think there is a place for that. I think there's a place for that.
Right.
If we're talking about the instruction of children, raising children, and just to really clarify about the motivation when it comes to my parents, I believe that for them it was a matter of salvation versus damnation. And so
in their eyes, you would agree it was the right thing to do for them.
So,
or would
yes.
it have been? Imagine a scenario where your father, pastor, or mom is teaching in a Christian school, both considered, strong Christians. If there were a scenario where they said, "Son, we're not going to give you any preconceived notions about what your worldview should be. We have our faith. We will be happy to share it with you, but we want you to experience whatever you want and find what draws you and is the most satisfying to you." If you had that experience, would you have considered that to be hypocritical on their part if they truly believe that there is only one way for salvation?
Well, so here's the tricky thing, because the approach that somebody would have when they're evangelizing to anybody who's not their child would if you take out constant persistence, like it would be present the information and pray about it, but then that's all you can really do. You can't force somebody to become a Christian, but you can tell them exactly what they, need to hear. And I think that on a deeper level too, when you get into maybe some of the nuances of different systems of doctrine within Christianity, specifically Calvinism, and the idea of predestination, irresistible grace, what I find really tricky is this sense of, I think that somebody who's a Calvinist, they have to be willing to accept fundamentally that their child may never be a Christian and that there's nothing that they can do about it. In fact, I think that generally speaking, based on my understanding of Christianity, Calvinism aside, fundamentally you have to accept that some people just will not become Christians and there's nothing you can do about that. All you can do about that is share the news of Jesus and pray for that person. So what's interesting about that is, and I'm not a parent, I've never raised a child, so it's maybe funny for me to talk about how to raise a child when I've never done that, but I feel like you have to strike some kind of a balance between, I'm going to teach my kid what I believe to be true, while also deeply, fundamentally accepting that that kid may never be saved. That kid might go to hell. I think that you have to be consistent, truly accept that and be okay with that. And I think along with that comes a sense of, what is the instruction about how we just treat people in general, regardless of whether or not they're Christians, based on the Bible or based on the New Testament or based on what Jesus taught. And ultimately, I would say that would be, to love, respect, treat others the way that you would like to be treated. I mean, we don't have to go into all the Bible verses where Jesus is talking about how to treat people and the importance of love. But I think that oftentimes what can happen is and this is speaking from experience, but I experienced a certain degree of alienation and chastisement. And it becomes really murky because on the one hand, when you start diving into it, you get into issues of, well, what do you do when Christians are misbehaving? And how do you treat a Christian who is sinning versus how do you treat somebody who is not a Christian? And it's dicey because I think that there are some people, and I've seen these people, who it seems like they're a lot better at chastising than they are at loving. And there's probably a reason why when Jesus encountered that situation where a bunch of people were going to stone a prostitute, that he said, whoever is without sin, throw the first stone.
Mm-hmm.
And it's tricky because, this just kind of plays into, and maybe I'm getting a little bit lost in the sauce here, because there's a bit of a loop that can happen where we can talk about human nature and we can talk about what the Bible talks about and say, oh, well, Christians they're just falling into, we're all humans, so we're all going to make mistakes and we shouldn't be acting this way based on what the Bible says. So you can't go by what Christians do because we're fallen and they shouldn't be doing that. And I get that, but also too, when your personal experience is not pleasant, it really makes you wonder, okay, do I want to be surrounded by this? Do I want to feel this? So back to your original question about how Christians, or specifically, my parents raised me and their intention. I think that their intention was pure. And I do think that my personal belief when it comes to religious people who are raising children is I think that there has to be, for one, an acceptance that your kid might be going to hell within the paradigm of what you believe. Two, I think that there needs to be a balance between presenting the information with conviction and also allowing the opportunity for somebody to make their decision. And then the third, which is tied to the second, is being willing to accept your child for how they turn out. Because there's just so many cases where there's no acceptance at all. And I think like a really classic example is people who came out as gay, who grew up in a Christian community. And I saw that a lot in my community. And I've seen the way that people have reacted towards those people. And, but that's not the only circumstance. There's there's kind of like a list of taboos, of Christian taboos.
Mm-hmm.
Being gay, living together with your significant other before you're married, maybe tattoos, maybe less so, but for some people it's a big deal. For others, it's not at all. Maybe those two, the ones that are relational, though, I would say are the big hitters. Those are the ones that seem to really rock people's worlds in a cataclysmic way.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh,
Sure.
my kid is gay.
Sure.
Oh, my kid is living with his girlfriend. And I don't think that that's informed by like a certain practicality. Like I could understand being upset that your kid is getting tattooed from a practical perspective of being like, man, I really hope this doesn't affect his ability to have a career. I can understand that.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, when it comes to sexuality, that's a whole different ballgame. And I think it's really tragic because there's just a lot of people who, there's a lot of pain and a lot of hurt in those situations. And I think that it comes from an expectation in religious communities that their children will also share the same faith. And I think that that's toxic in any religion, whether it's Islam or Judaism or Christianity or Hinduism.
Well, let me, I'm sensing a hint of a conflict here, a little bit of a contradiction. Maybe not. Maybe you can clarify. So early on, you were talking about your exposure to the churches that you were part of, both here and in Canada. They had kind of a clubby feel. Everyone was echoing each other's feelings about how, you know, basically just strengthening their own views amongst themselves. And there wasn't this radical difference that you would expect to see from Jesus's teaching in their community. They looked very much like the rest of the world. They were striving for nice things or whatever it was. The root of that, you said, looked like hypocrisy. You remember saying that? So you had this view of these kind of cliquey churches that were sort of hypocritical, and you thought, wow, if these claims are true and people need to know this, and this is a matter of life and death, we should be out there evangelizing. You said you considered distancing yourself from them and really diving into maybe mission field or something like that to focus just on that. But the hypocrisy was a big turnoff. But then you said another factor that was very big was the pain that you had in how, I'm guessing it was your family was dealing with this relationship that you had with the woman who was not Christian. And there was a lot of agony that went along with that. But it sounds like that agony itself, that what was being presented to you was nothing like what you described in the churches that you were talking about, where there was hypocrisy. People weren't really living what they believe. Now the pain came from people actually living what they believe, and you wish they'd kind of throttle back a little bit and maybe not be so strident in their beliefs, that to give you a little bit of room to, you know, expand your boundaries. And in neither of those cases did you bring up anything that had to do with the truth of the claims of Christianity. So what I saw is an emotive response and not necessarily some evidence to suggest that these claims are not true. And so it sounds like a lot of your experiences, the things that have caused radical changes in your life, have been based on emotional responses, being part of a relationship and how those relationships have played out, rather than a conclusion you might come to on your own after making an investigation of claims and determining that something is true or not true. So was there a point in all of this so far in your story where you came to the determination that the claims of Christianity, therefore there's hypocrites, there's people, I feel bad when I'm talking about these issues. That would not lead you to a conclusion that they weren't true. Was there an additional set of investigations that you did to change your mind on that issue? Or was it just the effects of your Christian experience?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Before I answer that, I want to clarify one thing.
Okay.
You mentioned my experience with the hypocrisy of the church, and then kind of conversely, almost like a maybe to like too religious, like people who are really leaning in.
Right.
I would clarify that in that experience, I think that there is a difference between, I think that what I experienced actually was an emotional response to my actions as opposed to a theologically informed response.
Okay. And that's at this point in your story. You have a lot more story.
And
Okay.
And I just want to clarify, I think that there is an element to which there is just a degree of traditionalism that comes with any kind of religion. Like people have faiths, they pass these faiths down to their children and their grandchildren. And I don't think that anybody is immune from that. And so I think that whenever within a family line there's any kind of deviance from that, it's met not necessarily with a reaction that comes from a place of theology, but more of a like, hey, you're not supposed to do that because that's not what we do. That's not what we do as Christians or as Muslims. I think that there can be two things happening there. It may line up with theology, but I think that the gut reaction is more so from this isn't normal, why are you doing that, like, response. To answer your question about evidence, investigation, rationality, once I came to that realization that, you know what, I don't think I'm a Christian because I believe it. I think I'm here because I was brought here. And I don't want to call myself a Christian because I don't want to misrepresent that faith, because it's not authentic for me to say that. So I'm not saying that it's not true. I'm just saying, look, I am not one of these people because I don't have anything to back that up. I don't believe that Jesus is the Son of God. I don't have an active belief in a God. I don't have an active belief in no God. I don't know what to think. So what I find interesting, so I've read some literature from different Christian apologists. Shout out to John Dixon. One of these days we'll do a podcast together. I've been to Israel. I've been to Nazareth and Galilee, and I've been to Jerusalem. And you know, when it comes to the evidence, what I find really interesting is there's a conversation among Christian apologists about the evidence for Christianity, that the evidence is there, the case is there. And on a philosophical level, I have a contention with that, because at the end of the day, you still have to take a leap of faith that cannot be proved. It's impossible. You can prove that Jesus was a real man. You can prove that he was crucified on the cross by the Romans as like a political uprising kind of guy. You can show documents of people who said that people who reported that Jesus did all sorts of crazy things. But at the end of the day, if you're going to believe that Jesus is the Son of God, even if you can prove, so you can't prove, there's no evidence that proves that Jesus rose from the dead. There's no security camera footage of like this guy rolling away the stone in a ratty old, mummified getup. You can say, look, these are the other options and they don't really make sense. Even if you could prove that Jesus rose from the dead, that is miraculous, that's incredible. That doesn't prove that he's the Son of God, that he is the creator of the universe. So ultimately, every faith system requires a leap of faith.
Hence the name faith system.
Yes, absolutely. And so I think that it's funny when Christians take the approach of like really trying to get somebody cozied up with the evidence. Because
I wasn't
because it's
attempting
different
to do that. I was asking if you had an experience.
And I understand that. Yeah, I know. But I've just had a lot of conversations about this with Christians when it comes to the evidence. And I think that the word evidence, when used in that way, can be a little bit misleading, because evidence can be used in a trial and is used in a trial. It's crucial to a trial. But the only things that are put on trial are things that we know for sure are possible. Someone was murdered, someone was robbed, someone was assaulted, money was stolen. It's things that are just a part of our reality, and it's so ingrained in our reality. We know it on a fundamental level that it's possible. Evidence points us in the direction of figuring out who done it. The fingerprints, the blood splatter. I mean, how many true crime podcasts are there walking somebody through all the things where you're like, oh, he's the guy. There's no such thing as, the heavens declare the glory of God. Yes, I get it. Poetically, like, this world is intricate and beautiful, but also I'm the one perceiving it.
Why do you suppose that is? I
think that people have been wondering that for the entirety of humanity.
Well, I mean that seriously. Like, why do you suppose that there's ever been two dogs sitting up on the top of the hill in Sherwood that said, man, just look at that sunset. It is gorgeous. Like, do you suppose that happens, that squirrels recognize that beauty, or are they just looking for the next nut and trying to have sex and survive?
Well,
it seems that we're unique in that appreciation, but do you share that?
I mean, it definitely does, but also too, we have to be cognizant of the fact that we're the ones. It gets really bizarre to talk about, because we're only talking about it because we can. Like, being conscious,
right,
being here, having this life experience. We wouldn't be thinking about it if we couldn't do it.
Right.
But we can, so we do.
Right.
And the world that we see is the world that we perceive, and we work with what we got. But, when I think about the universe and I think about how vast it is, it just seems so unfathomable that somehow I could know ultimate truth, or that, and what I don't mean, like, that's not to say that I'm a nihilist, but because I think that there are levels of like, morality that's a whole different conversation that we could probably spend a completely different podcast on. But it just seems to be a wild claim for somebody to make, that they have the truth of the whole universe. And I can't help but wonder, why is it that we've been having these stories since the dawn of time, since before Jesus and after Jesus? There have been all sorts of wild stories, whether whether it was, the gods of the Babylonians, or whether it was Moses in the burning bush, or, the Egyptian gods, or Joseph Smith and his golden tablets, or Muhammad and his experience with the angel. I mean, history is chocked full of these encounters that people claim to have, and I cannot downplay the significance of those things, because for whatever reason, it's almost like a part of our operating system as humans. And it's something that from probably the beginning has been co-opted by people for means of control, because it's so powerful. I mean, if you want to control a population of people, be the one in charge of their faith. And then you got them.
I consider myself a strong Christian, and I agree with everything you just said. So there's nothing that you said that I think is counter to Christianity. In fact, I think Christianity offers reasons for that, but those reasons are not related to your story. So let's carry on. We've gotten to a point where you have had some relational experiences that have impacted your view as to whether you want to continue the Christian, continue in that, what you had from your upbringing.
Yeah. To really hone in on the rationality and the evidence, I would say at this point in my life, my relation to Christianity operates from a philosophical and an observational standpoint. Philosophical, I would say, just on the whole, okay. For one, I think it just seems unfathomable that anybody could really have, any kind of ultimate faith claim. Two, all faith claims require belief. Regardless of any kind of evidence, they require a step of belief. And whether that's like something that just happens naturally, you just wake up and you're like, oh, I just believe this. Or you have to make a choice that just hasn't happened for me. Three, I mean, I think it's kind of funny that sometimes, because I've had this conversation with Christians, and it seems like there's this attitude of like, take a year off of your life and go investigate Christianity as hard as you possibly can. And if you find that you can disprove it, then there you go. But really, it's not my job to go out and prove the falsehood of something that currently is not a part of my life. I mean, there are other world religions that would also say, hey, you should look into our evidence too. You should check it out, because we have the ultimate truth. We have the key to salvation. And I'll be honest, I'm not interested in taking a year off of my life to explore every major world religion to find the true one. I love to read, and I love to study, and I love to talk to people, and I'm always willing to listen. And I think that what makes more sense to me is that this is a lifelong journey. And listen, I understand that it's salvation and damnation on the table, but maybe this is arrogant of me to say, but I am not terrified of those realities. I'm not afraid of hell. I don't have this existential dread of that. In other words, I'm chilling. So, I don't call myself an atheist. I also don't call myself agnostic for philosophical reasons. Philosophically, I think that it takes the same amount of belief to be an atheist as it does to be in any other religion, because you have to believe that there's no God. And that just seems like, for one, atheism is just kind of cringy to me and depressing. Like, if you're going to believe something, you might as well believe something happy.
But again, yeah, that's the thing that fascinates me, is all of these keep coming back to what it sounds cheesy to say what makes me happy. What causes me the least pain? What can I use to avoid pain? And what makes me happy? So let me ask you this, just based on what you've said. Would you say that you would prioritize, which would you prioritize higher? Truth or happiness? If you had to slightly sacrifice one for the other, which order would it go? Would you embrace a truth that would make you less happy? Or would you embrace a happiness even if it was rooted in something that you didn't really think was true?
It's an interesting question. A couple months ago, I stopped watching the news, and I've been significantly less anxious. Then again, is the news true? We don't want to get into that. I think that's a funny question, because there's the age-old saying, ignorance is bliss. And I think that is a saying not for nothing. I think that there is a truth to ignorance is bliss. There's also another funny, it's like a meme. There's a meme where it's like Jesus knocking on somebody's door, and he's like, like, knock, knock. And the person's like, who's there? And he's like, it's Jesus. He's like, Jesus, what do you want? And Jesus is like, I want to save you. And the guy's like, save me from what? And Jesus says, save you from what's going to happen if you don't open the door. It's, in a way, this whole system of faith, when you think about it too long, it can be bleak and depressing, to think like, okay, well, why did God go through the trouble of making us if he's just going to destroy the people who aren't in the 144,000? Though I think that that's actually like a bullshit reason to not be a Christian, like, just because you're upset with God, because ultimately, if there's a God, it doesn't matter what you think, like, you just got to suck it up. So, but still, depressing scenario. I think that both are important. I think truth is important. I think happiness is important. But the thing is, life isn't that straightforward.
But I mean, yes, I think everyone would agree they're both important. But if you had to slightly prioritize one over the other, which direction do you think you would lean? Would you be inclined to say, I'm going to pursue what will make me happy, because that's in this point in my life, that's a large part of what I would consider a good life?
I bet you that when it comes down to it, maybe if we exchange happiness for survival, what most people would actually choose, whether they want to admit it, is survival. And I think that most people are operating on just the most fundamental impulses that we have as humans. Like,
okay, so survival might be at the top, but still, I'm not saying these are at the top. I'm just saying in relation to each other, mm-hmm. Where would they fall on that totem pole? Where would you be more inclined to embrace something that made you happy, even if you weren't convinced it was rooted in truth? Or would you be more inclined to embrace a truth, even if it meant you were going to have to sacrifice some happiness for that?
I think that if we're going on a hierarchy of needs, of like human needs, mm-hmm. truth is irrelevant. It's really just about survival. happiness is a part of survival. Yeah, I don't know. It's a really hard question to answer because I think that it really just depends on. Well, first off, it's a really general question.
Mm-hmm.
Truth versus happiness. If you had to choose between one or the other, I mean, without any kind of context, those are just such big umbrellas. But probably happiness. Yeah, I mean, if you told me, if we made this more extreme, look, you can have a miserable life, but you'll know the truth. Or you can have a happy life, but you'll never know the truth. I would choose the happy life.
It's kind of the Matrix.
Sure.
Right? Wasn't that sort of the gist of the Matrix? Is
sure.
You're living in a fake world and you were surviving. You were doing okay. I don't know if they were that happy, but they were okay. Or they were miserable, it seemed, and they knew the truth. It's been a long time since I've seen The Matrix, but
it's a great movie.
Yeah.
I mean, how do we?
I want to have steak again. Remember?
How do we?
I'd rather have fake steak than.
How do we know that we're not in The Matrix? I mean, I just think that when you really sit down and think about it, I don't know. I have been presented the evidence of Christianity, the evidence that people and apologists and Christians say is the evidence. And it hasn't been enough for me to think, yeah, I want to give my life to this. But also I would say that most people who are Christians don't want to actually give their life to it based on what I've read in the New Testament. I think that most people are just traditional Christians. If we're talking about just Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's because what I've read in the New Testament about Christianity, it is not a small thing. It is a big deal. There's a reason why Jesus says, like, to follow me, you must hate your family or something like that. Like, basically, you are choosing Jesus above all else. And not being attached to the things of this world. That is actually very countercultural in our culture. I would say very few people that I would say, I know very few Christians who I look at and I think, wow, that person looks like what I read about in the New Testament. I've met a small amount of people who I believe are doing that, but most of what I've seen just seems to be people who have found something that makes their life make sense and that works for them. And if we're talking about happiness versus truth, well, maybe they actually fall into the happiness category because they have decided not to really even think too much about their faith or challenge it because that would cause some severe distress in their life. And that's my observation. My stance right now, when it comes to why I do not call myself a Christian, if it's threefold, it would be experiential, observational, philosophical.
Do you think in the decades to come, since you are very young, will you continue to look at different worldviews, and do you think that you will settle on one at some point, or are you just saying, I don't want to commit to any?
What do you mean when you say worldview?
Well, you were saying that.
So I think everyone has a worldview.
Of course, but you're spending time looking and enjoying and appreciating that this culture has a different worldview than I do, and taking that in and going, oh, that's interesting. Maybe not adopting it, but recognizing it for what it is. And you've appreciated this one and this one and this one. And you're recognizing there's a whole lot more out there than my little Christian worldview that I was raised in. So you're experiencing that there's a lot of ways you can look at this world. But is it your intention then to never have one of your own? To never say, I see the flaws in that worldview. It causes people to be selfish or greedy or legalistic or something like this. And I have found one that is not contrary to truth and seems rational and reasonable and fulfilling for me. Do you see yourself adopting that, or are you going to just continue to kind of...
Well, okay, I think that there's maybe a little bit of equivocation here with the word worldview.
Okay.
If we're talking about worldview as something that's like a typical titled belief system, for example, Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, etc.,
or the lack thereof, would result in a worldview.
Okay, sure. Then my answer would be, it's possible. It's totally possible that one day I might say, yeah, you know what? This worldview actually I really align with and I believe it's true. It's possible. But I think that generally speaking, everyone has a worldview. I think a worldview is just a framework through which you understand and relate with the world. And I think that that's actually probably changing at different rates for everyone. I think maybe certain people have a more solidified, more concrete worldview than other people. And I think that part of that has to do with age and experience too. There's the old adage, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. I think that there can be a similarity where somebody who's seen a lot of life might have a certain view of the way that they see the world, and that doesn't maybe change for the rest of their life. But that being said, everyone has to have a worldview because it's impossible to live in this world without a worldview. Mm-hmm. You might not be able to articulate it, and it might not align with a mainline faith or philosophy. But everybody has a worldview. So I would say that I have a worldview. You have a worldview. Everyone I know has a worldview. My worldview, while it's not a Christian worldview, has been influenced by Christian values. Definitely. I'm grown up in a Christian society. Well, Christian community. I've grown up in a liberal democracy and a wealthy society. There's all sorts of things that have shaped my worldview.
Okay, one last thing. Maybe two. What you're working toward some ideal, I would guess, in your life. You see a picture of what you would view as success that you're working towards. What does that look like? Like if everything went your way, where would you be in 10 years or, whatever, down the road? I know that sounds silly, but what is your idea of the goal?
Yeah. What's funny is I did a podcast last year with a guy named Nate Appleman. He's the head of innovation of Chipotle New Ventures. Really cool guy. Celebrity chef, dude. And we asked each other that question, where we saw each other in 5 years. What I said was that in 5 years, I wanted to have a box truck, converted box truck, with a podcast studio inside the box truck, and I'd just be on the road doing interviews. And what's funny about that is within a year of saying that, I was already on the road, not in a box truck, but doing interviews on the road. I think that success for me Obviously I have like a picturesque dream vision of my life that I would like to have in the future. But I also think that there's a difference between an attitude or a way of being and a milestone that you might imagine 10 years in the future. I think that both are tied together. They're both important. I would say that when it comes to, and the reason why I say the way of being is important is because I think that it embodies success. I think for me, the embodiment of success is as somebody who is creative, honoring that gifting and that passion and giving birth to things constantly and not, I think that the antithesis of success would be to complete the metaphor, to be barren, to not show any fruit of any kind.
Mm-hmm.
So
as long as you're doing that
to me,
regardless of what it might look like,
that to me is the overarching successful life, is as somebody who is a creator to constantly be creating and improving, getting better. I think that I feel very different from maybe some of my other creative peers in that I wouldn't consider myself to be a specialist. I would pride myself on being a generalist. Hot take, but there are a lot of things that I do and a lot of things that I'm passionate about and a lot of things that I've done. And while some people might say, well, you should just pick one and just get really, really good at that, I think that the most important thing for me is that if I have an idea in my brain, I'm able to bring it into this world. And that might be a book, it might be a poem, it might be a van, it might be a podcast, it might be a business. But the ability to translate something that was a thought and bring it into the world, to continually honor that process, that to me would be a successful life as a whole. Now, the dream and all those things, that's different. That, you know, there are things I would love to achieve, you know, and places I would love to go. You know, I would love to have a family one day. I would love to have that box truck and be on the road. But I think while it's important to have those goals, and I do have those goals, and anytime I've set a goal that I've said, this is the thing that I'm going to do, I do it. Life brings changes and unpredictability. So I think it's easier, or maybe not easier, but it's maybe more important to find what is the way of life where you feel like you are living a good life. I mean, it actually goes back to Plato's Republic. The idea of, you know, finding the purpose, like the use of the sword, the use of the hammer, the use of Sheldon Kozushko or Callan Crossland. I think that's the most important question. That's my perspective as somebody who's not religious. Is figuring out what is your thing that you do. And that is going to be idiosyncratic. So you got to figure it out. You got to read some Carl Jung. You got to read some Joseph Campbell. You got to, I don't know. pick up the New Testament maybe once in a while, or take a walk through the jungle. Whatever you got to do, you got to figure it out.
Well, I wish you the best in maintaining that creativity and pursuit of those kinds of ventures, and always birthing something.
Well, I appreciate that. I got a question for you.
Uh-oh.
After all, it is my podcast. Can't escape without one. In your years of life, what advice, and I'm just stealing a question here from one of my favorite podcasters, Lex Friedman, but I think it's one that I'm always curious about, especially when I'm talking to somebody who's my senior. What advice would you give to a young person nowadays for how to thrive in this life on a practical and holistic level?
The advice I would give is to put truth above happiness. I think that the pursuit of happiness for happiness' sake is somewhat of a fool's errand. And there is something much more foundational in truth that you can count on than you could ever count on pursuing happiness. Now, the pursuit of that truth leads to a lot of happiness, but it's not the goal.
How does somebody pursue truth in this day and age?
Yeah, that's tough. But I think it requires a deep evaluation of your own motivations, because only you know why you do things. And you know if your rationale for doing it is completely selfish. You're aware of that. And you're okay with that. And a lot of the culture will support you in that. But I think it leads to despair. And I think there's something about truth that can create situations that are difficult and some pain. But in the end, they are much more solid and worth basing your life on, even though there's conflict, there's a little distress, but you can lay your head on your pillow at night knowing that in the pursuit of truth, you lived your life for that pursuit. That's more fulfilling to me than, man, I had a good time. And clearly that's not for everyone, but I can only tell you what's worked for me. And I don't fit the mold, as you know, that you described in someone who was raised in a faith and is that faith because they were raised in it. When I was raised in the Jewish faith, that's a great example of putting truth above happiness in my life, is that I got all kinds of grief for simply declaring that I think that Jesus is who he claimed to be. That's a tough thing to do to a Jewish family. But if I were pursuing happiness, I would probably just stayed in my Jewish faith. My mom holds happiness in the highest regard, and she's very comfortable in her Jewish faith. And so you can imagine it creates a tension. And I'm working very hard to maintain a good relationship with my mother, but I cannot sacrifice that truth. So she knows that I will declare my faith in Christ, and she's okay with that. She's okay. But I just made that decision not to put my happiness on a pedestal above truth.
Yeah, it's interesting that you made the point about it'd be potentially happier or easier to stay in the Jewish faith for the sake of your family.
Yeah.
Because I can relate to that. I would say the same is probably true for me.
Right.
It would be easier
Right.
to just be
and
a Christian.
I would never encourage someone to stay a Christian because of that. In fact, I had a parent come up to me in the lobby and she said, "You've got to help me. My son changed his religion on his Facebook page to agnostic."
Oh boy.
And I said, "Well, good for him." And she said, "What?" And I said, "He's finding his own path. He's not riding your coattails anymore. He's discovering his own faith. He's pursuing it." I mean, I'll be happy to talk to him, but the last thing I'm going to tell him is change it back to Christian. Pursue it. It's got to be yours.
I agree 100% about that.
And so I said, now don't just go, "Well, I don't think anyone could ever know, so it's a waste of time to pursue it." I said, don't stop there. The chance that it's critical, that's a real chance. There's a real chance that this is critical. So don't just throw it aside. Pursue it. Do the work. Come to the conclusions. But don't ride your parents' coattails because they're Christians.
I agree. I think it's really fascinating that the stats have shown for a long time that so many kids who grow up in Christian homes, as soon as they leave high school, are done with Christianity. But I think that, growing up, that was always given to us as like a statistic to be disturbed by. I think that there's no reason to be disturbed by it. It's just simply, okay, well, these are just humans who have to make their own choice. And
right, but you can understand a parent's disappointment.
Well, see, that's an interesting word.
Yeah.
Disappointment.
Yeah.
It's a natural human emotion, obviously. But I think that it's misunderstanding from the Christian perspective. It's misunderstanding the human's place versus God's place. I guess it depends on the theology that you believe, but who's the one who's doing the saving? Is it you or is it God?
Right. But
how can we be disappointed?
Let's use your hypothetical father as an example. I don't want to get into personalities. This is your hypothetical father.
Sure.
Let's say that your hypothetical Christian father pictures God doing some work in your heart down the road that causes you to come to the conclusion that Jesus is the Messiah and should be your Lord and Savior.
Mm-hmm.
He is in anguish about the amount of time between now and then because his belief, this hypothetical father, is that his direction for you is the perfect direction for you. And so it is in your best interests for you to follow that Lord.
But why would there be anguish? Especially with the idea of irresistible grace if you knew, okay, he's not a Christian now, but he will be in 10 years.
But you don't know that.
Well, right.
You suppose that that's a possibility.
Yeah. Well, but then that's the...
If it's not a possibility, then it's a moot point.
Why is
but
there
if it
anguish?
is a possibility, then there's all of these decades that are going to waste.
Well, see, that's really interesting.
Frustrating.
But why? Because if God is the only one in control, ultimate control, and if he has chosen who he will choose, then why would we allow our emotions to be invested in something that's completely out of our control? Isn't that insane? I mean, to think, man, I really hope that he becomes a Christian, and right now, oh my goodness, this is just so terrible, so hard. I mean, man, if you believe that God's chosen who he's going to choose, and that, you know, whoever's been chosen, it's only a matter of time, and eventually they will, I would think that there would be a lot of peace in that, because all you would have to focus on is your own life and just telling people what's up. Maybe that is looking at humans as robots.
It doesn't sound like a very loving thing to do.
I don't understand the duress. But the duress aside, I think that there's a difference between duress. You know, like you can maybe another example would be like looking at a friend who's an alcoholic, and you're like, man, I can relate to that pain of looking at a friend who's an alcoholic, and you're just like, oh, this guy is so awesome. If only he could just kick this habit. Because he's got so much to offer the world, and he just can't right now because this thing has a grip on him. Mm-hmm. I can relate to that feeling, which is something that's out of my control.
So would you be able to replace the work of Satan with the work of alcohol?
I mean, I am not going to lie. I hate the use of the word Satan, because
I do too.
It just sounds like a fairy tale. It's like,
I agree.
What are we talking about?
I have a hard time. But I have to. If I truly believe that Scripture is true, I have to accept that there are forces out there. I agree that it seems silly to have the, devil with the red horns and the pitchfork. But my point is, you said if there was something like alcohol that was dragging him down, you would wish that was no longer the case. And I could see from a Christian perspective that there are powers in the world that would be trying to drag you away. You have dabbled in music. You've had a touch of fame and success in that area. And
I don't know about fame.
Okay. But certainly it's appealing, right?
I mean, it is appealing and also not appealing at the same time. That's a hard road.
Yeah. So from a hypothetical parent's perspective, you could see the concern that they would have, and that they would want that to be over as soon as possible. If you knew that someone was an alcoholic and they were not going to be an alcoholic in 30 years, would you say, knock yourself out, have another bottle? Or would you try to minimize the amount of time? I don't know. It's not a direct correlation. It's a bad analogy, but I don't think what you're suggesting is that parents should be okay with their kids rejecting God and saying, I don't need you, I'm on my own, when they have a deeply held belief that God's direction for you is the best direction for you.
I guess there's just an inevitability to this equation. The inevitability is that you have this group of people, a child, children, and their parents. And if the parents hold some kind of a religious belief, inherently baked into the situation is that if those kids depart from that belief, it's going to cause a situation.
Yes.
And I guess that's just reality. But there are different approaches to how you handle that. And I would say that on the scale of how that's approached, there's a practicality that comes into play.
Okay.
And I think that on one hand, you have people who lose the relationship. It's severed and it's never coming back. It's tragic. And on the other hand, you have people who are 100% able to maintain it. And then you get everything in between.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that, you know, when it comes to, it's a human relationship just like every other one. They're tricky, they're complex.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, my hope, if I'm thinking about how I would react as a parent to my kids, I would try to give those kids every bit of knowledge and information and piece of wisdom that I have to give them the best shot of success. But the most important thing that I would want them to know is that despite whatever they would believe or do, that I would always love them and accept them. So, and I think I am probably not the only person out there who came from a religious family who had moments of doubting that because of the way my experience was just existing as somebody who's not a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's complex, and I don't want to, because I'm really grateful I have a really wonderful relationship with my family. That doesn't mean that there's been extraordinarily hard times, and that, I mean, I would say that the position that I have is one that I fought for, of saying, this is who I am, but I love my family, and my family's important to me. So just get over it. Because family is more important to me than any of this kind of quibbling about faith. Like, I don't care about these things. I really don't. I actually care more about, like, being able to get together and be in the same room and enjoy each other's company. That's what I care more about.
Mm-hmm.
That's my value.
I get that.
So
that clarifies to me why you would not why you are not an evangelist for this. Why you would not, for instance, encourage your brother to do the same thing, because the result you're looking for is not rooted in the rejection of Christianity. It's in the ability to maintain family relationships in a loving way. And that would not help that situation at all, right? Is that a fair?
yeah, I would say that that's mostly true. I mean, I am definitely critical about Christianity. I'm critical about churches. I'm very critical about churches.
Okay.
That is different, though, than Christianity.
Yeah, no one
Big
has
time.
ever said you should follow this Christian.
Yeah. And I do think that there's a lot to talk about in terms of
There's certainly a lot
churches.
of hypocrisy throughout history, but it sounds like the criticism that you're sharing in your family situation is not rooted in hypocrisy. It's something else. It's not hypocrisy.
Well, you know, I wouldn't agree entirely with that, because, like I said, I think that based on what I've read in the New Testament, belief in Jesus is radical. It's extreme.
Mm-hmm.
And I just don't think that most people are actually that extreme.
No. I'm talking about in your relationship within your family. The problem that you have is not there could be hypocrisy. You could suspect hypocrisy
I'm saying
elsewhere.
I'm saying that even within my own family, I don't think that I witnessed that kind of I think that there's a fundamental level of attachment to this world that I still witness in my own family that seems counter to what I read in the New Testament.
But yeah, I get that. That's a critique of
But I would call it
people in Christianity. What I'm talking about is in the interpersonal relationship that you have, and the tension that has been caused over a long period of time. When it was, let's go back to when it was at its worst. You obviously had an expectation that this should have been handled differently.
I wouldn't say an expectation, but a hope.
A hope.
Or
okay.
a wish at this point. It's not a hope. It's a
But the criticism is based on you saying, if I were you, I would handle it this way.
Well, yeah,
it's
definitely.
not based on, I think that this is counter to your religious convictions. Right? That hypocrisy. You were never accusatory of saying, I don't think you are living out your Christian faith in this. It was how that faith was being lived out
in
that you
in that circumstance. In that circumstance, yes, but I was accusatory of hypocrisy in other aspects as well.
Yeah. Well, you've made it clear at the beginning that your view of what the ideal Christian would look very different than what this world, what this society, what this culture would build up as normal, right? So when someone's living what seems to be a fairly normal life, that's not how you imagine the ideal. If someone truly embraced the call of Jesus, then that picture wouldn't look that way. In your head, is that a fair representation?
Well, in my head, but also in the pages of the New Testament. I mean, go and make disciples of every nation. Is that a commandment for just a handful of people, or is that a commandment for people who are followers of Christ? What does that look like? Or what does it look like to trust in God for provision the same way that the birds are fed and the flowers are watered? What does it mean to actually turn the other cheek? What does it mean that the poor are the ones who will inherit the earth, and that it's harder for a rich man to go through the eye of a needle? When you look at
the meek will inherit the earth.
The meek will inherit the earth. The poor, blessed are the poor
Yeah.
for the blessed are the poor for there's the kingdom of God, and they get something better.
Yeah,
they get the kingdom of God. The meek just get the earth. What am I to think when I read stuff like that?
So I'm a little perplexed here. It sounds like what you're saying is that your understanding of what that means is more accurate than your parents' understanding of what that means? Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is that it appears to me that there's a cognitive dissonance between the culture of Christianity that exists in the United States and Canada and the supposed words of Jesus that anybody can just read in the New Testament.
And so your takeaway from that was that it's not true, or it's not worth pursuing?
No, that's
a curious response to the rejection of Christianity based on a deep understanding of what it might mean to be a Christian.
All that I was trying to say is I just don't actually believe that most people who say that they're Christians are actually living as followers of
But
Christ.
what does that have to do with Jesus? I don't understand.
Well, it just is a head scratcher. It makes me wonder, what is this religion all about? You have how many people who call themselves Christians, and yet if no one is really doing the thing, then what is the thing at all? It's
you think no one's doing the thing?
I think I've met very few people who call themselves Christians who I look at and think, wow, yeah, this makes me think about the character of Jesus that I've read in the New Testament. That's not to say I haven't met nice people and kind people and people who are generous, but when I think about, this world is going to pass and people who haven't heard the name of Jesus are potentially in peril, I don't know. There's just this lack of sense of urgency. And that's the thing, is people's actions dictate what their actual belief is, whether they articulate it or not.
I'm getting more confused. Before, you were stating that if we had an understanding of Calvinist view of it, then we do not ultimately make any change in who God chooses.
But there's still an obligation to go and
to participate in that whole process, right? So when it came to you, it seems you were wishing that people would just throttle back a bit and accept me for who I am. But when you studied Jesus, you're saying, why aren't they out there spreading this news like crazy with a fiery passion? So I'm getting a weird throttle back actually, or go full bore.
I think that's kind of the whole point. Actually, is that what I experienced was that the people who were the most critical and even the most cruel, and obviously, without getting into specifics, you can only take me at my word for that, but those people weren't the people who seem more interested in being cruel than telling anyone else about Jesus. And that, to me, is hypocrisy and traditionalism.
Okay.
And I experienced that directly with certain individuals, and it wasn't people who were just my family.
But I'm still not, and maybe it's because I'm fixated on truth. So I'm still not getting to the point where you said, people aren't living the way I think they should live based on Jesus' teachings. And so therefore, I'm rejecting Jesus' teaching. That's what I'm not understanding.
Here's what I want you to know, or what I want to know from you. You keep framing this as my personal view of Christianity.
Right.
But how is what I'm doing by reading the New Testament any different? I get that there are people who go to seminary and study to become pastors and are preaching the word. But at the end of the day, if the Bible is the word of God and people should be able to read it, and I'm not... What I've quoted is just actual quotes from Jesus.
Right. Yeah.
It's not I'm my not disputing any interpretation.
Right.
But it feels in a way like you're trying to invalidate that perspective by saying, "Oh, that's just your perception of Christianity."
No. I'm sorry. I never meant to do that. No, I think your perception is absolutely valid. My curiosity comes from how you could perceive those things and then come to the conclusion that either it's false or it's irrelevant to you.
Well, but
that's the jump I didn't make.
I've never made the statement that it's false.
Right.
In this entire conversation.
But
what I have
the statement
said
that it's not worth pursuing.
Well, what I have said is that there's reason to pause and wonder, why is it that there is a religious belief that it's so hard to find somebody who actually seems to align with what I am reading with my eyeballs in the New Testament? Why is it so hard to find? Like, I'm reading the New Testament, and it's just so hard for me to find somebody who lives with that kind of conviction when we live in a society that seems more focused on material things, getting a good job, getting a good home, having a wife and kids, and the things that make a normal life. And I'm not saying that those things are wrong at all. What I'm saying is that there's a disconnect. What I see is a disconnect. I see a major disconnect with the words of the New Testament and then the actions of the Christian community at large and specifically. There's just a cognitive dissonance. There's a vast ocean of difference between those things, and it just makes me wonder what is actually happening here on a sociological and a psychological level. So I get what you're saying, that this doesn't get to the question of ultimate truth. But philosophically, I would say maybe you and I have a different opinion fundamentally about whether or not somebody can know ultimate truth. You would say, correct me if I'm wrong, that an individual can know ultimate truth. I would be skeptical of that claim, fundamentally.
Okay. And I'm fine with that. Could you see that someone could read the New Testament and feel a conviction to change their life based on what they read, and they would come up with a direction based on that would be different than the direction you would come up with based on that?
It's certainly a possibility, yeah.
That someone might feel called to go into a different field. Let's say a guy runs a strip club and reads the New Testament and goes, I don't think I should be running a strip club. I'm going to run a mini mall with a laundromat and a convenience store instead. That's his personal conviction, change that he sees God would want him to make in his life. Now, he might be the only guy in the whole world that comes away going, I should open a strip mall with a laundromat and a convenience store. But that's his conviction. That's could be what God placed on him, this change in career and this recognition that people were being hurt by the industry he was participating in. So I come along and I read it and I go, wow, there's radical change I need to make in my life. And that's unique to me. And you read it and went, wow, it seems like the appropriate response to this message is XYZ. And you're going, wait a minute, why isn't everyone doing XYZ? Well, maybe that's not what they're called to do. So when some guy spends his life translating Bibles into a new language, that's a serious commitment to do that. He feels called to do it. He has the ability to do it, the desire to do it, and he's going to reach some group that had no chance of getting God's word. His experience could be very different than mine, where I go, hey, there's a church in town that needs someone to kind of take care of a wide range of things and has some knowledge of computers and stuff. You know, I think I could make a difference in the Christian community for the better if I went this direction. So the idea that how you perceive God's call on you, if in fact this scripture is true, the idea that yours would align with someone else's seems slim. What it sounds like you're saying is that the call on them, or at least how they're living it out, or the degree to which they're living it out, doesn't meet your approval, for lack of a better word. And so therefore, instead of critiquing them on their own response to that word, you have not concluded that the word must not be true. You said that. But concluded that you don't want to participate in that at all because you're what you feel is the appropriate response, no one else seems to be doing. Instead of what would have seemed to me, if truth was above happiness, might be that you would say, wow, that would be an enormous call on my life, but I believe this is true, and this is going to be ugly and messy, but I need to pursue it. So I'm assuming I must be missing some point in there in how you got from point A to point B, because it doesn't, saying he's not doing it right is only a reason to do it differently than that person. But to say he's not doing it right, and therefore it's nonsense, or therefore there's no call on my life whatsoever, those two things don't connect for me. So maybe you could help me make that connection.
Well, the thing that you're missing is the other part of the conversation that we've had where I explained my reasons for why I don't identify as a Christian. So it's not specifically just that. In fact, that's ultimately... But
they were all relational, right?
No, they weren't.
Oh.
No, I said that there are three main reasons why I would not consider myself a Christian.
Okay.
Philosophical, observational, and experiential.
Okay, so observational is experiential, but you're talking about in your personal life and outside your personal life.
I would differentiate between observational and experiential.
So for experiential, you're talking about related to you. Observational, you're talking about related to other people?
Yeah.
Okay. So,
I mean, the simplest answer of why I'm not a Christian is that I don't believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God.
That's a great reason.
Yeah, that's probably the simplest thing to say.
Yeah, but that's a truth claim right there.
That is a truth claim.
Yeah. So that I can relate to. If you say, I have examined the evidence and I don't believe it is sufficient to come to the conclusion that Jesus, the claims Jesus is making, the claims of the apostles after him, I don't believe the evidence is sufficient to believe those are true. Okay.
And I would say that. I would say I've examined the evidence. The evidence has been presented to me. And it has not been sufficient to make me believe without a shadow of doubt that Jesus is the Son of God.
Well,
and on top of that, I would say...
That's a ridiculous criteria, but because there's not a single other aspect of your life that you live without a shadow of doubt.
Sure.
Okay, so...
But on top of that, I would say that I have reason to be wary and suspicious of Christianity as well as other religious institutions. And that informs my relationship towards those things and those people. That's different, though, than why I'm not a Christian. But that's just adding to the complexity of how I feel about all of this and how I interact with it and how I relate to it.
Well, okay. So let's look at that. does the possibility exist that someone could be a Christian and have the exact same feelings that you have about other people in the church and their lack of sense of urgency? So that's not actually a reason to not be a Christian. There are Christians who have that same problem.
I never said that it was. Okay. I was merely pointing out something that was a head scratcher for me.
Mm-hmm.
See, there's a difference between things that are, reason for pause and reason to wonder, and the actual belief.
Okay.
I don't think it's straightforward. I don't think that it's.
No, I agree. I agree with your claim that it does, in the end, it does take faith. And I am confident that you have received the best information on the evidence from John Dixon in Israel.
From John Dixon. Once again, shout out. John,
so,
let's do a podcast.
So there is no doubt in my mind that you are somehow lacking the data, the information. And I'm comfortable, as you would want me to be, knowing we have no more information. And now we leave it. The rest is up to God. God changes hearts or he doesn't. So
apparently,
if you're okay with that, I'm okay with that.
Well, I don't think I have a choice, do I? So
no, you really don't.
It is what it is.
Yeah. I hope that it's good to continue to kind of work these things out, find out how you got where you are, continue to pursue that truth. I have, being raised Jewish and spending 8 years living in the Middle East, I've got a lot of exposure to Islam. And then to after that, come back and investigate Christianity and go, I think even you would agree to this, that of all the major religions, there's far more historical evidence to support Christianity than there is to support the other major religions. Would you agree with that? Historical evidence. And that probably comes from the time frame.
Yeah, I mean, whether it's convincing
first or not.
Off, I'm not an expert on religion, so I can't speak definitively to other religions.
Okay. Fair enough.
Am I skeptical about Muhammad receiving a revelation from an angel? Yeah. Do I think that Joseph Smith received golden tablets? I doubt it. Am I skeptical that Jesus is the Son of God? Yes, we've already covered that.
Right.
Hinduism is interesting because I just don't know the history of it, and I also don't know how much of a blend there is between people believing like, okay, this is just, doesn't matter if this is real or not. It's like a framework that we orient our life around.
Right. And that's been my experience, both with Hinduism and Buddhism. Getting down to truth claims is not a relevant thing to do. This is a framework to help you live your life.
Mm-hmm.
And as you said at the beginning, frameworks are helpful.
Well, and here's the thing too. There are fundamental truths that can come through fictional stories.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's what Joseph Campbell is all about.
Yeah.
What he writes about is these archetypal characters and narratives and story arcs that have been with us since the dawn of time.
Mm-hmm.
There's a fundamental truth that can be found through things that are made up.
Right.
And maybe that's because it's actually inside us and it comes out when we write a story or we tell a story. We can't help ourselves. Who knows? I think that there's a lot to be curious about.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it that we can't get away from religion?
Mm.
That's a good question. I think that that's something worth digging into. Why is religion so powerful, have such a grip on people, regardless of the religion? It affects everything: money, sex, politics.
Yeah, I have having some understanding of fallen nature. It is not a mystery to me at all that someone could look at the potential of religion and go, "Oh, that right there is the ticket. That is the key to power. We grab a hold of that, we've got an enormous amount of power." I think that would be one natural response to this inner longing we have for understanding a higher power, is that someone would use that and abuse it. I have no doubt that would be one of our fundamental traits, which, someone could say, well, then how can you be a Christian? Well, the fact that exists in us doesn't negate the fact that one of those mythological stories, from the past could be true. But it does explain how every religion is abused by people like that. And it's a shame, but that's the way we are. We see a potential power grab and we go for it. And people are vulnerable, and it's a shame. It's a horrible thing. I don't think it changes anything of Jesus's teachings, but I think I would be very surprised if that power vacuum wasn't filled by somebody. That's just the way man is. It's not a good thing.
Yeah.
So, that doesn't surprise me. But I think you said it'd be worth pondering why we have that inherent sense of something else besides us.
It might not be a sense, it might be a longing. Or it might be
perhaps
a need.
Yeah. But whatever it is, it does seem to be universal.
Were we created in God's image, or was God created in our image?
That's the question. There was an old saying, if God did not exist, man would have surely invented him. Well, there could be some truth to that. Christianity has speculations as to why that is. I think they're as good as anyone else's. But
well, we'll find out when we all die, right?
That's right.
To end it on a morbid note. I don't know,
I'm okay with that.
I'll be curious. I'm a curious guy. I want to find out.
Okay.
But
well, thank you for sharing the first half of the story. I think I only got the first half.
Oh man. Well, thanks for putting me on the hot seat, Callan.
I didn't mean to put you on the hot seat, but it was the only opportunity I've ever had to ask someone honestly about their experience. And I've been so pleased to hear it. I really appreciate you doing that. I know it's uncomfortable. It can be.
I'm glad that you were receptive. If anything, I hope that this conversation can just prompt more conversations, because it's something that people want to talk about. So all you deconstructionists out there,
oh jeez,
get on it. Go crazy in the comments.
You pick the next subject. We'll dive deep.
We'll do it. We'll do another one a year from now.
Okay.
Different topic.
Sounds good.
Thank you, Sheldon. Callan. Appreciate it, man. Until next time.
All right.
Thank you for listening to the Spring Street Podcast. If you'd like to support the show, sign up for the Patreon to receive exclusive behind-the-scenes content, and check out the sponsor links in the description.